Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first MOTIONMETRIQ free webinar series. Our first in this series is going to be video capture in bike fitting. My name is Pádraig Medlin. I'm the founder and CEO of MOTIONMETRIQ, which is our technology company. And I'm going to tell you a quick story about how I got involved in video capture, and then I'll let Andy introduce himself. So in 2003, I had a lot of people coming into my fit studio saying that they'd had a dartfish fit. Team about 2 months ago from the UK. We're very, very excited to have him be a part of our team. It's amazing to have a sports scientist on staff. It's already helped upgrade what we offer to the public and to you, our fit education audience, and also to our consulting clients. So I'm going to turn you over to Andy Brook, and he's going to lead off in our webinar.
Okay, thank you, Pádraig. So my name's Andy. I've been fitting for the last 10 years, mostly in the UK, but the last 2 months over here in Scottsdale, Arizona, in the US. So along the way, I've done a master's degree, and I'm just finishing up a PhD in cycling biomechanics. I've used a lot of different technologies through both bike fitting and research, and this is some of what I've learned about video along the way. So today's topic is video capture in bike fit. There we go. We're going to cover some technical considerations using video cameras, how to set up a fit studio for video capture, and then outline some practical uses of video capture software. So to begin with, we're going to jump straight in with some basics of cameras and camera choice. So frame rate is something most people in video and are familiar with. So what we've got on this slide is, if you look at the diagram on the right hand side, we've got, that's good. So on the right hand side, we've got a diagram of the crank, and I put some red lines on there to demonstrate what these charts show. So on the left hand chart, we've got frames per second across the top, so that's the kind of the quality of the camera, and then the cadence on the left hand side. So if you're pedaling at 80 RPM and the camera is capturing at 30 frames per second, then these red lines on the diagram on the right hand side are going to be 16 degrees apart. So there's 360 degrees through a pedal stroke, creating a circle. Each frame is going to be 16 degree steps through that pedal stroke. Then if you go up to 110 RPM and you have a camera that captures at 100 frames per second, those steps become only 6 degrees, so they're much smaller, much easier to freeze the frame in exactly the point that you want to analyze. The frames per pedal stroke is that second table on the right hand side there, and I guess that shows how, if you use the crank diagram as an example, as a reference point, the first table shows the distance between those red lines, the second table shows how many red lines there would be, and those red lines represent the point at which a freeze frame would occur. So what we're trying to get across with this is that the slower the frame rate, the bigger the jumps between the frames in terms of the pedal stroke. So for example, if you're only running a 30 frames per second camera, like the webcam I'm using for today's webinar, and you get a client in who's a really high spinning athlete up at around 110, then there's going to be 22 degrees between each frame. So as you scroll through frame by frame, what you're going to see big jumps, and what that means is that you could be up to 11 degrees away from where you want to record, and you might have to go all the way through the next pedal stroke to find that point that's a little bit closer. So why is it 11 degrees? Well, if you think that if this is the last frame and the jump is 22 degrees, then it's going to be either closer to this frame or closer to this frame, unless it's bang on in the middle, which is 11 degrees away from either frame. So is 11 degrees so much that we need to worry about it? Well, yeah, it probably is a bit more of a jump than we would ideally like. So what we generally suggest is that something around 60 to 100 frames per second is better. You know, obviously 30 to 60 doubles the frame rate, so it halves that gap in between, the jumps in between frames, and that can make a really big difference. So how many frames do you want per pedal stroke? Well, obviously that's related to how big the jumps are in between them, but you can see that if you're up at 100 frames per second, then I'll get a laser pointer on here because I think that'll show what we're looking at. So here, you know, 100 frames per second, 80 RPM, you're getting 75 frames per pedal stroke. And even at 110, you're still getting 54.5 frames per pedal stroke. So you're getting a lot more data with the higher frame rates. The downside to that is that the size of the files created becomes really, really large. If you think about the amount of data that video is creating, if you go from a webcam at 30 frames per second up to a high-end camera at 100 frames per second, that's more than 3 times the frame rate. So it's 3 times the data. You're going to need some good cables connecting your cameras to your computer, and you're going to need a computer that can process that and save it quickly.
And Andy, just to make one point on that, we have 100 frame per second cameras that are super high resolution. We have about 50 terabytes of video capture over a 10-year period. So when you're dealing with terabytes of information, it'll fill a terabyte hard drive in less than 3 months if you're capturing very high resolution video. So it does, if you're using those higher spec cameras, it does create some logistical and IT related considerations.
Yeah. So resolution is that next point that Porrick was talking about. So what I've done here is tried to create a very practical consideration for resolution. So the image on the left there is a rider that we'll see in a bit more detail later on in the presentation. We've got a knee angle drawn on there, and what I've tried to do is basically create a triangle. So if we imagine that we've got the length of his femur here, the length of his shank or lower leg down here, and then I've added a third line that makes it into a triangle. So we've got some examples here of my thigh and shank lengths, and then this is a fit customer I had last year. So I've given them the same, the knee extension exactly the same. So this angle in here is 140 degrees, and then this distance here is basically that blue line. So we're calculating how far apart your hip marker and your ankle marker would be with these parameters. So that's our angle, they're 2 sides of a triangle, and then this is calculating the third side of that triangle. So if we then change the angle by 1 degree, how much does this measurement change? Well, it's 2.3 to 2.8 millimeters. So what that means is if your top marker is out by as little as 2.5 to 3 millimeters, then you're going to be introducing a degree of inaccuracy. So let's think about how that affects camera resolution. Well, if your resolution is really low and the image is quite grainy, then if you don't have the ability to zoom in, or you're just guessing, or you're trying to, you know, do a remote fit and you're just going, right, that looks like the middle of the knee click and that looks like the middle of the hip click, you could be out by quite a significant amount. So if you're introducing, you know, up to 10, 15, even more mil of difference there and there and there, then what are you getting out the other end? So the key is to have good markers, good resolution that allows you to place the measuring tool exactly where you want it, and then you're going to get some accurate measurements out the other end. So accuracy matters, not just in terms of resolution, but in terms of where you place your markers, which we'll touch on a little bit more later in the presentation. Higher resolution does create bigger file sizes, and the so hardware needs for that are The cables, probably looking at something around USB 3 rather than standard USB. A hard drive that would be able to save those files much more quickly would be important. So if you're going high resolution and high frame rate, you know those files are going to be pretty big, and there's going to be some demands on your IT equipment as a result. So next slide, lighting and shutter speed, really important considerations. So shutter speed refers to how long the shutter stays open, and therefore how much light gets into to the camera. So it's easier to think about this when, or more commonly thought about in terms of taking a still photograph, because we kind of, old school cameras, we used to have that click. That was the shutter opening and closing again. So if the shutter speed is low, so it opens, so we kind of open up and then stay open and then close down again, you're going to get a lot of blurring. So those photographs you've seen of car headlights and tail lights, and they create blurry lines up the road, that's because the shutter was open a long time. When it comes to fast movements, you get exactly the same blurring, because the shutter is open while the foot or the pedal moves around. So you're capturing the pedal, let's say, being here and moving to there. So it's going to blur the movement between those two positions. Increasing the shutter speed helps to limit that blurring, but it reduces the amount of light that gets in. So to counter that, you need to make sure that your Fit Studio is nice and bright, and that should help with any blurring effect, or help you increase the shutter speed. So depending on the system you're using, you're going to get some control over this with high-end cameras, and you're going to be able to force the shutter speed, or set the shutter speed rather, where with automated systems, maybe like a webcam or something like that, it's going to do it all automatically. So in those instances, there are some limitations that make things quite difficult working with a webcam, but with a high-end camera where you can control these settings, and you can then run through some trials and get the right amount of lighting for your setup, that gives you a lot more control and a lot better video out the other end. So talking about the aperture kind of opening and closing, it doesn't just open to a fixed amount and close to a fixed amount. There are different f-stops or apertures which control how much it opens. So a low f number will be more open and create a brighter image. A higher f number is less open, so it'll let less light in and create a darker image. The other side to all of this is how much that opens up determines the depth of the field. So if you're looking side on with a cyclist, you might not need a huge depth of field, but you'll never, or you shouldn't just be looking side on. You should also be looking front on. So if you think, if you're looking at a cyclist side on, you only really need a focal depth of roughly the width of the person. A little bit more to allow for a buffer, obviously, but it's not a huge depth of field until you turn the rider and start looking from the front or the back. Because if you're going to be looking at the back, you want to be looking at markers on the back of their pelvis or their lower back. And if you're looking at the front, you might want to see their hands, but you definitely want to see the front of their knees. So the depth this way, when you're looking at the front or back, becomes a little bit more important than looking side on. So a low F number creates that shallower depth of field. A larger F number goes a bit deeper. For cycling, we probably need neither extreme, so somewhere in the middle will probably do, but just be aware that obviously if you're closing down that aperture to a smaller opening, that's restricting the light, and you need to compensate by really well having a really well lit space for your Fit Studio. So light reflection is another consideration. What we don't want is for a light to cast shadow, make things difficult to analyze or see. So the optimal is, as with this photograph on the right hand side, for the light source to be as close to the camera as possible. These ring lights are fantastic. They allow the camera to look through the middle, and so that light source is as close to exactly the same as the camera as possible. If you have multiple cameras, this is a consideration not many people think about, but let's say you're looking at the rider from the side, but then you've also got a front camera, and then your rotating platform only needs to move sort of 180 degrees, and you've got the back and the other side. You're going to need multiple sources of light for that because you've got multiple cameras. So you need one light coming from the side, one light coming from the front or rear, whichever direction things are facing. The other consideration here is to think about the background. Does it provide contrast to the rider? Is it shiny? Is it likely to reflect a bit too much light? That's certainly something to consider and be aware of. It makes things a lot easier to visualize, but also to measure if you can definitely see the difference between the rider's back and the background, for example, or anything else. So you definitely wouldn't want kind of skin tone walls, that's for sure. So the parallax effect, getting a little bit more technical now. Parallax effect basically says that the camera should be at 90 degrees to the rider. So with this top diagram, we want the camera here looking completely square to the rider. The further you get away from being square, and don't forget that this can occur in two ways. It can occur through the camera being slightly off angle, or the rider being slightly off angle. So if you combine the two, you can end up with a significant error that you're just unaware of if you're not controlling these things. So the reason we've got two diagrams, one up on the top right and one bottom right, is that a lot of people think about the parallax effect if we're looking from above. So, you know, is the camera side on, or is it, you know, edged slightly over and looking at an angle? But we often don't think about it in terms of being of a height that is appropriate for what you're looking at, rather than looking up or looking down, because that can introduce that very same parallax error or effect again. So what expected measurement errors can you see? Well, it only takes 10 degrees to give you a 1 degree error in measuring the angle. So 10 degrees sounds like it's quite a lot, but actually, again, you know, you're talking your platform, if the platform's off or the bike on top of it, the turbo trainer has moved, the camera's off by a couple of degrees, all these things can add up to create a 10 degree offset that you just didn't even realize was there. So we're going to talk a little bit later on about how you can control for these things and how to really set up a Fit Studio to account for them. But another thing that we have in our Fit Studios is the cameras are mounted, they're wall mounted on sliders, which gives us a lot more flexibility. If we want to focus on knee angle, for example, we'll lower that down to really reduce that parallax error or any risk of the parallax error. The MOTIONMETRIQ software that we use and that we've created and developed actually has a lens flattening algorithm in it that takes into account some of this parallax error and reduces the severity of it. But ultimately, if you control for these factors to begin with, you reduce the risk of them becoming a problem anyway. So if you can slide the camera lower, if you're focusing on the leg and the knee and ankle angles, and then slide the camera higher if you're looking at upper body measurements, you're going to get much better recordings, much better quality information. So this is taken from the Basler website. Basler are a big camera manufacturer in sport and exercise science, and this is a tool that they have on their website that helps you select lenses. And lenses are really important because they can help you fit into a certain space. So what I've done is kind of input, you don't have to input all of this yourself. I just input the distance between camera and rider, and then the size of the capture area or the area of interest. So with cameras being sort of a widescreen format, really we would be looking at something around 1.8 meters, both in height and width. That would give you everything you need. But obviously when I put in 1.8 meters in height, because of the shape of the capture area, it just increases the width there. So I'm not saying we need 2.4 meters. You know, that would be a very, very long bike or a very strange position if you needed that much length. but it's just so that we can get the height required to look at both feet and head in the same image. Now with that wall slider, we could actually decrease this, decrease it quite significantly, and then we'd be able to decrease the distance to the rider as well without introducing that parallax effect. But one of the reasons I wanted to put this slide on there was, if you look here at the top diagram where we've got a 6 meter distance between the camera and the rider, even when you get to the edges of those that capture area, so you're still only seeing a viewing angle of 22.7 or 17.1, which, if you think about that parallax effect, it's not just a case of the camera pointing slightly off, it's also a case of the angle from what you're looking at to the camera. So this is a really important factor. You need the camera to be centralized on what you're looking at, and for that thing not to go too far towards the edges of your frame. So if you were further away and had an appropriate lens that created these kinds of characteristics, you would know that your capture area without experiencing anything more than a 1 degree parallax error would be much, much larger than it would be for here, for example. So a couple of things to sort of consider there. Firstly, you know, how much space do you have in your fit studio? How far away from the rider can you be? And then secondly, what lenses can you do to make that work? What can you do with your camera to make it work? So a sliding scale, a slider on the wall that allows you to move the camera is a massive help. And then things like the lens flattening algorithm in the MOTIONMETRIQ software. All of these really help us get what would traditionally be a large fit studio into a much smaller space. So setting up your fit studio, we touched on this a little bit earlier with respect to kind of trying to keep the everything square and horizontal and perpendicular. That's the word. Thank you. So this is a little diagram of how we set up our fit studio. So this blue line at the bottom is the wall, the red is the camera. So there's a box underneath the rotating platform, and we place a set square or a level tool or any kind of straight edge actually would work for this purpose. And then you can either measure from the straight edge to the wall and make sure that those two are the same, and then you know that you're square to the wall. We then set up a laser level tool, which are incredibly useful. If you don't already have one, they're not super expensive, but they are incredibly useful. So we can set the laser level up along the line of sight of the camera, and then we can identify the optimal position for the camera. We can identify and put some markers on the floor and the rotating platform, so that as we rotate this platform, we know that if that laser level lines up with any of these markers, we should be completely square with the rider. So controlling for these things, again, just helps reduce error, helps reduce that parallax effect, and make sure that another big strength of this is that if you see a rider again in the future and your studio is set up exactly the same way and you put that rider in the same position, you can overlay the image, which is something we'll show you a little bit later. And then you can see how they've changed since you last saw them, how the bikes have altered, whether the bike has altered. So yeah, that's a really powerful tool that we'll go into in a bit more detail shortly. So the platform should be held in place so that it doesn't walk. That's a key thing. So this block effectively underneath the platform, some of them are round, some of them are square. You need to, what we've done is create a little 4 strips of wood that we screw to the floor around that box. So that box can't move. And we know then that as we rotate the platform, it's always going to end up in exactly the same place. That's a huge thing, because what you'll find with rotating platforms is they'll go one way a little bit easier than the other way. And if you keep pulling in the same direction, then it just starts to migrate across the floor, and before you know it, you're almost out of shot and nowhere close to lined up. So having the platform held in position makes a big difference and is really, really useful. So our MOTIONMETRIQ software is optimized for a distance of 6 to 8 feet. So that's between camera and rider. Okay, so what we wanted to do as well today was provide a little bit of sort of practical take home. So we're going to run through 3 key markers that we use a lot in cycling. Firstly, the lateral malleolus, which is on the outside of the ankle. So the way I've described placing the markers is based on a textbook that helps scientific researchers place markers. So it's a pretty robust method, but it does take a bit of practice to feel out those bones and get a real knack for it. So what you would do is place your thumb and forefinger on the posterior and anterior edge of the malleolus, which basically means place, depending on which side and which hand you're using, the thumb on one side and the finger on the other side. And then as you work your way down that lump, obviously it starts to come together, and where your fingers touch will be at the we call it the most distal point, but the furthest point away from the body, which is obviously up this end. And then you're going to place your marker just on the outside edge of that furthest away point, that lowest point, if you like. So that's how we place our lateral malleolus markers. We tend to do it at bottom dead center. So while they're on the bike, when the pedal is at the bottom of the pedal stroke, because it creates a relatively neutral ankle angle. The ankle isn't one that hugely alters if you were to apply it at the front of the pedal stroke. If you were to apply it at the top of the pedal stroke, you would probably see a lot more dorsiflexion or a completely different ankle angle, and then you might end up with a little bit of marker movement between positions. So we generally suggest putting it on at bottom dead center. Next one is lateral epicondyle, which is a lump on the outside of the femur. The reason we use this is if you look at this articular surface here, which is that sort of lighter blue section, that's not round. So what that means is that the knee is not a perfect hinge. You cannot find a point in the middle of it and say, right, that's where it rotates around, because actually that surface is, well, it constantly changes shape, but it's almost a big oval. So at different angles, it moves by different amounts. So what we do is we take, and scientific research does this as well, we take the lateral epicondyle, which is just around about here where that green marker is. So firstly, that gives us a line through the femur, so we can be pretty confident that from the greater trochanter to this marker here is a straight line that represents the actual tracking of the bone. And secondly, as that rotates around, it tends to stay relatively central to the tibia below. So it does give us a pretty decent representation of knee angle. One thing to be aware of is different bike fit educators and different bike fit systems place that marker in a different place. So you cannot just take recommended ranges and apply them to anything you like. You need to get the marker set for those recommended ranges and use them in conjunction, otherwise they're just completely useless. We'll come on to how much use they are anyway a little bit later. But yeah, without controlling and making sure that you're using the right ones, they're completely pointless. So how to find that? Place the knee in a flex position somewhere around the 3 o'clock or 90-degree point of the pedal stroke. You would put your thumb in the joint space at the front just here, and then trace backwards along the joint line, and then somewhere around here you're going to come across the lateral collateral ligament. So you'll feel it as a little ridge, and then if you follow your thumb up along that lateral collateral ligament, where that's its insertion or where it connects. So that's the recommended method for finding it. The reason we go at the 90-degree point through the pedal stroke is that represents kind of halfway through that bend. So it's not at its most extreme bend or its most extreme straight. and therefore the error and the movement of that marker is going to be limited. So when I talk about movement of markers, generally I'm not talking about it kind of migrating on the skin because it's sticky, it's going to stay in the same place. What we're talking about is we're putting a marker on skin that tries to show where a bony lump or reference point is below that skin, and the skin can actually move around on top of the, so you know, if I put my finger on there, you can see I can actually move quite a lot in different directions without ever losing contact with the skin. So that happens a lot through movement. If we were to bend and straighten the knee, we would see the bone move around under the skin. So we want to put a marker in a place that represents something close to an accurate position throughout the whole of the pedal stroke, and that's the way that we do it. So moving on to the third and final marker placement we're going to talk about today, the greater trochanter. So those three markers then give you two sides of a triangle, and you can then work out the angle between, or just two lines that you can work out the angle. So if you place the pedal at 90 degrees, again, for the same reasons as the knee, we want it to represent a larger proportion of the pedal stroke accurately. So we don't want to place it at an extreme at the bottom or at the top of the pedal stroke. So what I would suggest is if you place three fingers like this, and then kind of glide them up the outside of the thigh until you find the bony lump. What three fingers does better than one is that if I'm trying to find something that's bony, all I'm getting the information back is that it's hard. It doesn't tell me whether it's higher than the point next to it. It doesn't tell me if it's lower. So if I go in with three fingers, then I can see that if that finger's lower and this finger's lower and this one's higher, then I've found the kind of the midpoint or the highest point. And just moving around like that can give us more information than trying to go with one finger. Okay, we've got a question, so let's just, yeah, okay, thanks. Let me know if you have any issues with volume. I'll try to lean into the microphone and stop the volume fluctuating so much. So if you're able to do that, then you can find, if you imagine rubbing your hand up the thigh this way, then you're going to come across this lump. And you'll go a little bit past it, and then it decreases, and you can find the highest point sort of up and down, but those three fingers will also give you the side to side. So if you end up kind of like that, I guess, rather than flat, then you know that you've found the highest point side on, and that's where you would place it. You place it on the most prominent highest point. Sometimes this bone can feel very, very flat and dish-like, so that's a little bit harder. In that case, you can imagine that this is the bone, and it's actually obviously much smaller than that, but you could place your thumb and forefinger either side and then just come into the midpoint and place your marker there. That's going to be a pretty good representation. So once you've got those three markers, that enables you to get some joint angles out of this. So for example, knee angle at full extension, we generally look for something around 30 to 40 degrees. As I've already said, different markers result in different numbers. So these numbers will only be in any way accurate for our marker set, which is that lateral epicondyle rather than the knee joint center. So if you were to place your markers in a different place, you would see different numbers, and that's why predominantly you would see differences here in recommendations between different fit schools, different fit methodologies. Oftentimes it just comes down to marker placement. The one thing I will say with recommended ranges is they are only really a starting point. So it's not something that you definitely stick to in every instance. It gives you a rough idea to know what common ranges are, but really it's for you to learn which of those ranges you can live a little bit outside of, which of those ranges are a bit more important. And if you've got some numbers that are within range and some numbers that are outside of range, and even with adjustments, some fall back in and some fall out again, you need to know which to prioritize and why those differences might be occurring. So I would definitely recommend not sticking to kinematic ranges and thinking that that's it, you're done. You really need to understand why those angles have been recommended, why they aren't, you know, the be all and end all, and fully understand the fit that you're doing. So education is always going to be the biggest thing about bike fit. Technology is great, but if you don't know how to use it, then you're not getting the most from it. So this screen here is just a screen grab of the software. I want to talk you through some of the buttons, some of the things on the screen, just so that as we go through a couple of slides later on, you'll be a bit more familiar with what we're doing and how we're doing it. So first off, top left, customers. Obviously, this isn't the screen that it would open up on. We've gone through the process of selecting the customer and getting all of their data through. So we've selected Kirsten Casper here. These are all of her captures through the recent session. So you can see that first off it's date and then it's time. So you can track those a little bit more easily. Three captures there on the 23rd, 4 more on the 21st, and 1 on the 3rd. So you can see that we were working through a couple of changes with her, a new bike and a few bits that that's why she was visiting on multiple occasions. But it makes it much easier for us to go back and identify which session and so on, because they're all clearly labelled. Analysis tools up at the top here. There's 2 ways of drawing on the diagram or on the video rather. These markers over here are the blue lines that you see currently. We call those perpetual markers, and these analysis tools would come up in red, although you can change the colour if you wanted to. And they would only show on that frame, and as soon as you click off that frame, unless you've saved the analysis point here, those red markings that you've drawn on are going to disappear entirely. So the perpetual markers stay on no matter what you do, which means that if I were to scroll through, at the moment we're at the front of the pedal stroke, I can push the arrows on my keyboard forwards and backwards and scroll through to the top of the pedal stroke or the bottom. Those blue reference markers would always stay there, and you'll see that in a second in a bit more detail. So what do each of these mean? Well, first off, this one's an angle tool, as you can probably guess from the picture, and we've got pelvic tilt here, we've got shoulder angle from the upper back there, and we've also got the angle of the sole of the foot from horizontal here. The next one is a tape measure that allows us to measure once the system's calibrated, and again, this is one of the really important aspects of keeping the rotating platform still, is that you can go through a calibration process that will tell the software, you know, here to here is X number of pixels, and that equates to however many centimeters or millimeters or whatever. So then by clicking on that and clicking on 2 sections of the two points on the screen, we can accurately get a measurement of the distance between those. Vertical line here is what we've drawn here, just gives us a reference point if you wanted to look at, you know, the pedal spindle, or a horizontal line. Often we use that to look at when we're looking from the rear, we want to look at those PSIS and how the pelvis is moving. Horizontal line gives us a nice reference there. And this little cross is just a point marker. So we'll come to that again in a slide or two, that just allows us to, let's say if we were using the perpetual marker and the little cross, we would put a reference just there, for example, scroll through, put another reference, and we could see how it's moved through that part of the pedal stroke. Often used for knee tracking when you're looking from the front, and that's the example that we'll show shortly. So down at the bottom of the screen, we've got the time. The capture runs for about 5 seconds, and then we scroll through and find the exact frame that we want. So you can play it. You can, in the bottom right, you can change how quickly it plays back, and you can jump to the beginning and the end. You can add a new tab, so you'll see up here. This is the original way you select customer, and then this is the first tab effectively. We could add a second tab here, which makes life a lot easier if you want to compare left and right when you're talking to the client and scroll backwards and forwards between the two. So that's really helpful. These analysis points, once you've drawn on and you want to save those, you can click on the analysis point, you can select what it is you're referencing, what it is you're keeping, and you can do custom ones and type in your own notes on there. But it saves all of those, that allows you to create a report at the end. Some other powerful tools within the software that we're going to look at a little bit later. We can compare videos. So I talked about having a rider come back 6 months, 12 months, 2 years later, and if we know that the platform is in exactly the same place and that rider is in the same place, then we can overlay the video from the last fit to the video from this fit and see how things have changed. We can also zoom in if we want to be a bit more accurate with placing those measurement points on exact markers or anything like that. So, okay. From the frontal plane, we've got a couple of vertical lines here. So that's generally placed through the middle of the ankle at the bottom of the pedal stroke. And then these are those little reference squares or crosses that I mentioned earlier. So at the bottom of the pedal stroke, pretty much bang on in line with the vertical reference line on this side. At the top, he just comes out a tiny, tiny bit. And similar on this side, but he doesn't quite come all the way in at the bottom of the pedal stroke there. But it's not a huge amount of lateral movement. We wouldn't be hugely concerned by that. If things were coming out massively, then we might be concerned. But as things are, it's not massive. With that measurement tool, we would be able to click on the center of that, then click on the vertical line and get an idea for exactly how much it does come out at the top of the pedal stroke. If we're happy that everything is nice and square and perfectly set up, then really what you use that for would be to assess symmetry side to side or lack thereof. Not necessarily worry too much about it being 13 mil on one side and 10 mil on the other. It's more, there's a 3 mil difference. It's not huge. We're not overly worried about it. But if it was 70 mil one side and 40 the other, then they're both really high and there's a massive difference. So that's something we really want to drill down into. So some kinematic measurements that we can take from side on. The great thing about video is how flexible it is. So if you can see it, you can measure it. With these examples here, we've gone quite sort of angle heavy. So we're looking at ankle angle at 3 different points through the pedal stroke. So this is at the bottom of the pedal stroke. Then you can see this one here. That's at the front of the pedal stroke, and then here's at the top of the pedal stroke. And then knee angle, we've got maximum extension here, and then this one, we're not trying to guess through the other leg. This is actually scrolling through to another frame and measuring this left-hand leg. So that's the maximum flexion in a different frame. Then here we've still got the pelvic tilt, the rotation on the pelvis, and then here we've got a shoulder angle as measured from the sort of the spine, rather than trying to come down to the greatest trochanter or anything like that. So we've also got a vertical reference line there. If we had recorded or if this picture was at the front of the pedal stroke, we could then put another vertical line through that tibial tuberosity, the lump on the front of the top of the tibia, compare it to the pedal axle, and then we'd actually be able to measure between those two and see whether it was in front, whether it was behind, and by how much. The great thing about these blue markers is that they stay on regardless of you scrolling through. So if you're drawing this on quickly to talk through things with the client, then everything stays there, and you don't need to analyze one frame, talk about it, go to the next frame, analyze it, and then carry on. You can keep doing everything, and then come back to the client and say, this is what we see at the knee, and we're really happy with that, or so on. So lots of things you can measure, and with being able to measure distances and reference points, you can create lots of information that you would need to be able to accurately describe what your cyclist is doing on the bike. Okay, what anatomical reference point do you use to measure hip flexion? Good question. So it depends what you want to get from it. So normally what we would do would be what I didn't say was that if you once you've drawn something, it's not there forever. You can move it around. It's quite easy to do that. So if I were to select this this pelvic tilt measurement, what I could do is move it up so that I had a nice straight line along the pelvis, but that bottom marker represented something through the thigh, and then I could grab this one and move it over, and then we would get the sort of femur angle relative to the sacrum or the pelvis. I think that's probably the most useful measurement if you're wanting to look at hip flexion. There are some other fit schools who do it from basically greater trochanter up to acromion, something on the shoulder, and then through the thigh, and that can be useful in certain respects, but what it won't tell you is this pelvic tilt component. So if that pelvis is really rotated backwards and there's a lot of curvature, then actually true hip flexion is decreased because relative to the pelvis is a bit more upright than that line would imply through the torso. So I think there are a couple of ways of measuring it. Just be aware that there are differences within that. But the way we would generally suggest doing it is try and get a straight line across the sacrum there, and then come down through the thigh segment. But what you need to do when you're measuring through that thigh segment, so if we were to measure it here, you wouldn't ever measure it at this point generally, but you want this blue line to go through those two markers so that you know that it's representative of the femur. So it takes a little bit of moving around, but actually once you're used to it, it's super quick and really quite straightforward. Okay, so I think we've covered a lot of the main ones from the side there. Got another question coming in. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. No problem. Right. So next slide is just a little video, and what I wanted to do is show how quick it is to mark somebody up. So if we can get this to play. Nope, not like that. So I'll talk you through as we go. Just paused it. So I'm scrolling through to the top of the pedal stroke. It's not top dead center. It's the point at which we experience sort of maximum knee flexion in that range. So this is a little bit clunky because, as you can see from the right hand side, I was doing this through TeamViewer, so it's not as smooth as it would be if I was recording it live, because there's a little bit of delay through using TeamViewer for this kind of thing. But yeah, we would. I generally start at the top of the pedal stroke, run through to the front of the pedal stroke, and I'm going to measure ankle angle across the top, the front, and the bottom of the pedal stroke. I'm going to put in a vertical reference line through the middle of the pedal axle. At the top of the pedal stroke, we're also measuring the maximum knee flexion. Then down at the bottom, again, it's not bottom dead center. It's the point where we see maximum knee extension. And again, we're just going to draw on the maximum knee extension and find out what that is. We're going to draw on the maximum ankle plantar flexion. And what you'll see is just there as I did that, there's a shortcut that if I press the shift key and drag down, it will snap to horizontal. So with the ankle angle measurements and the pelvis, our references are either horizon or vertical. And there's a little example of how you can move that around as well. So if you were to draw something with lots and lots of measurements on, and you couldn't see the numbers, or the client was getting a little bit confused or overwhelmed with the amount of data, you can actually just grab them and drag them over to different parts of the screen so that they can see more easily. But that's it. It took just over a minute and a half, minute 40, something like that, to mark out all of these things. And actually, it was a little bit slower because of TeamViewer. So you're probably talking a minute 15 to get all of this data on there. And while you're doing this, you're talking through the process with the client, explaining why you're doing what you're doing. but it's actually not that common that you would just chuck all of this on in one go, because chances are what you're doing here is you're creating a capture to assess a particular thing. So once you've done your baseline and you've got the position somewhere close, this might be a capture just to look at what happens to the ankle after we adjust to peak position, for example. So, you know, in that instance, we don't have to draw all of these on every single time. We might want to draw on the knee angle, because if we see a difference here, we would see a difference in the knee angle as well. But it doesn't mean that you have to draw this on every time. So actually, you can be very specific at what you're looking at, very targeted in what you draw on there. And I think that helps the customer kind of focus on what the intervention is, why you made it, and whether it's having an effect. So next slide is just a little video sliding back and forwards, showing the two bikes. So in this instance, this was a bike that we'd finished the fit on this bike. You can see she's not any handlebar tape, so it's a brand new bike. And this is her previous bike. So scrolling back between the two, you can kind of see the differences there. One, hood shape, hood size, you can see it comes up pretty significantly. And two, the saddlebag disappears, but the saddle is more or less bang on the same, ever so slight alteration. Let's play that through one more time, because the changes aren't huge. So just look at the nose of this saddle. Yeah, it moves ever so slightly. But what's great is that we can actually, if for any reason the bike had moved side to side, and that's not very often the case, or if the bikes were so different that the wheelbase was a different length, we have the option of clicking on the center of the bottom bracket on both bikes, and then it will overlay exactly based on the bottom bracket. So that's a really nice, powerful tool. If you're doing a multi-bike fit and they want their training bike the same as their race bike, to overlay them and show where those differences are, or if they're exactly the same in terms of the contact points, it is really powerful and really, really useful. So moving on. What we're going to do now is just come out of the shared screen. Actually, I'll run through this slide first, because then we can move on fully. So further learning, these webinars are an ongoing series. So every Friday we're going to run a free webinar. Every Monday we do a more advanced sort of educational webinar. So Mondays 10 AM, next Monday 4th of May, we're doing a webinar on an advanced physical assessment with Nate Cock, who is a PT, works with Trexo Fredo, works next door to our fit studio at a company called Endurance Rehab, and having those links is a fantastic strength to your bike fit studio. Next Friday, the 8th of May, 10 AM again, critical thinking in bike fit. We're going to run through some complicated case studies. We're going to talk you through our decision-making process, what interventions we made, what benefits they had, and so on. The following Monday on the 11th, we're looking at foot anatomy and insoles. And then the following Friday, there's a second critical thinking and bike fit case studies session. So the Friday sessions are free. The Monday sessions are $25 to watch live. There's an option to pay an additional $15 and to watch live and sort of own the recording in Vimeo and rewatch as many times as you like. So if you want to take advantage of this downtime to improve your understanding and your bike fit training, we are offering some one-on-one sessions currently as well at $75 an hour. So we can really target those to anything you want. Just let us know the topic you want to cover and we can do that. The MOTIONMETRIQ software that we've been talking about today is available as a bundle with a single camera for $2,000. So to get a fit studio set up from scratch, I think it's a really cost-effective and great place to start. But also it's a super powerful tool. It's really polished. And the reports that we're going to look at now, I'm going to have to share my screen in a different way. So bear with me a second. So we'll go Just do it like this. Right, so escape. Right, so this is our fit report that we can get out the other end. And to produce this is super straightforward. We click a few buttons and then click some tick boxes next to the analysis points that we've recorded. So in this instance, we can save those analysis points as left or right, which makes it a lot easier to tick the relevant ones. So we've got a description of what the angle measures. We've got some information on the landmarks and a rough idea as to what the range we would be looking at is. And this diagram allows us to compare left and right. It shows the pelvic tilt, it shows the maximum knee flexion and the ankle angle there. So we're pretty similar across those two. A little bit more toe down on this side, but you'd be running through that with the client at that stage. But what this does in doing it this way is, unlike with the perpetual markers that I showed with Kirsten earlier, you've got a lot of data on there and they're overlapping, and sometimes it's not super clear unless you're familiar with how to use the system, what it's measuring, especially if the frame has moved on from the item that it was measuring. Where these are very much, you know, frame by frame, this is the measurement point at this point of the pedal stroke, so it's much clearer for the client. It gives you a lot of really useful data. We've got that vertical line that we can look at the knee and in relation to the pedal. We've got the sole of the foot relative to horizontal. Then we go down to maximum extension, and we've got the same knee angle and ankle angle there. We can also obviously talk about some of the body measurements that's relative to the spine there and the upper arm. We can get some session reports. So if you wanted to recommend some ongoing activities, or you acknowledge that today's session was kind of coming up against restrictions. So it could be that, you know, in this instance, the core strength isn't there, or they're a little bit they're a little bit tight. Then, you know, you can recommend some soft tissue work with PT or a sports masseur, some core exercises, things like that. If you want them to work on things go away, this session report slide allows you to completely alter any of these notes that you want to. This second one is obviously a cue. If you want them to think about, you know, bending their arms when they're going hard, just write it down there. It gives them a reference point and a reminder that that's what you discussed. But also, if and when they come back 6 to 12 months down the line, you've got those notes in front of you. It's great to think that you remember everybody, but do you know exactly how they look and how they rode at the time, and what you recommended? You can you know, hold them to account and say, did you do your stretching? Did you do your core work? And if they haven't done it, then, you know, you can kind of explain why things haven't improved on the bike. So we've got some examples of custom here. So blah blah blah. This is, as the question earlier mentioned, how do you measure hip flexion? This is one of the ways. If you wanted to create something custom, you could write your own notes in there and say, this is what we're looking for, this is why we made the alterations, or this is why I would recommend X, Y, Z. Posterior view, another reference line through the middle there. Frontal view, and here you can see 13 mil just on the screen there. So we've got some, and yeah, we've got some measurements there that you can see how far the knee tracks out at the top of the pedal stroke. So reports like this are really powerful tools to help your client see what you've gone through, the process, why you've done what you've done, but also if you feel like there are limitations today and you could actually do better with a little bit of additional work, all those notes help you kind of guide that customer towards the idea that bike fit is a process and a journey, not an event or a single thing. So if we've got a little bit of time, that's the hour, but if you want to stay with us for a little bit longer, I think Porrick would like to run through some examples live on the screen to show you some overlays of you know, a before and after fit, so you can see how much the position has changed and that kind of thing. So, Porrick, are you there?
I'm there, thank you.
Okay, I will stop sharing and allow you to, can you share your screen, or do I need to give you permission?
And indeed, I'm sharing now.
Okay, excellent.
Okay, so is my screen up?
Yep.
So here is that same client. So one of my favorite things about video as a tool is the ability to be able to show a person postural changes. So this is our client. You can see it on here. You know, one of the things that we didn't really talk about, which I'd like to show you now, is, you know, the power of, one of the first things we'll do is slow down the video and just look at what's going on. This particular client has a short femur on one side and a long tibial tuberosity, was in orthopedic braces when he was a kid, has a ton of physiological and anatomical challenges. But what's amazing is he manages to even things out and actually pedal pretty well, all things considered. Now his pedal stroke is quirky, as you'll see when I hit play. So I've taken it down to 1/8 speed, and I'm just going to hit play. So you can see, you know, we talked about blurring. You know, we've gone to great lengths to make sure from a frame rate and a lens perspective and a camera perspective, this isn't a webcam. It's not something, it's not a low-end camera. It's, you know, it's $1,000 camera and cable, and it's all configured for with fit in mind. So when I want to stop something or wind it back or get it to a point of the pedal stroke, I'm just using my left and right arrow keys to move things around. In this particular case, I actually have two videos loaded up here. So I have a slider in the bottom right-hand corner. And what I want to show you with this slide is two things. First one is, this is a rider who went through tremendous change over 2 seasons. So I have him on his new team bike. He's a professional athlete. And I have him a year ago to show you what's happening. Now, as Andy just alluded to, you don't necessarily remember everything about your clients. So, I mean, I know he looks fitter. I know something looks different and better, and he looks better on the bike, but this was super powerful. So let's watch this. This is him the year beforehand. Now the position is a little different, but what I want you to look at is, look at the size of his glute max. So look at the size of his butt. Look at the difference with all the rehab he's done. So obviously this guy is different. He's fitter. He's got a longer position. He's got a new bike. He's got some other things. But you can see in relative terms, the kid who was coming back from injury, who was getting back into it, now is a whole lot more muscular, is a whole lot stronger, and is able to, you know, is obviously performing at a much higher level as a result. And I always find that super powerful. So I'm going to get out of this comparison and show you one more thing to emphasize a point for Andy, that Andy made. So when I go into customers and I pull up Grant, the thing I love about this software is, you know, I haven't seen him in 6 months. I remember most of the details, but all his reports are archived in his history. So if I double click on this report, there's his report that Andy shared with you. So before he comes in, all the things I've written and all the things I'm concerned about, I have a reference to that before he comes back in. So that's super powerful. So my notes are not dependent on a fit sheet or dependent on, you know, anything like that. I'm going to show you one more here. Here's an example of, you know, a world-class athlete that we work a lot with. If I do a compare video here, you know, a lot of the time we work on posture and we work on trying to help clients improve their posture or help them with different aerodynamic strategies. So one of the nice things to be able to show clients is just how much of a difference different postures can make. So here we can see how much of a difference, for example, something like shrugging makes, how much narrower that person becomes. So it allows us to show the clients what happens, you know, when we get them to modify their postures. Again, kinematics or body angles or joint angles are only part of the picture. At the end of the day, our clients are human beings, and they need to be able to see and be able to reference themselves in that process to be able to figure out, you know, what that means for how they move. Andy, also, just to emphasize a point, we talked here about, you know, perpetual versus screen markers. So when we do our pre and post analysis, you can see here on the left-hand side, here are the annotations that I've made for these various positions. So once I click on those, it brings me to those positions. So that's my saved screen drawing. So I'm able to see them right here on the screen. So I wanted to share all of that with you. Do we have any questions? I want to make sure that we answer any questions that are out there. I'm going to get out of screen share so as Andy can put that summary screen back up again with the other webinar dates. And Andy and I would be thrilled to answer any questions anybody has. So I'm going to stop screen sharing.
Yeah, thanks, Warwick. I'll bring back up this this PowerPoint, and what I'll also do that I forgot to do but should have done is I'll just whack in here my email address. Just should you need to contact us, this is the best way to get in touch. So the websites there are I'll do that on the current slide. There we go. And then back up. Right, so yeah, they're the next 4 webinar dates, and my email address down at the bottom there. There are the websites for Cyclologic, which is the shop, the Fit Studio arm of the business. MOTIONMETRIQ is the software and the education part of the business. So they are sister companies with similar goals and objectives. So yeah, thanks everyone for attending. If you do have any questions in the future, feel free to get in touch. My email address is there. And yeah, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, everybody.
What's the brand of the light source shown in one of the slides? I don't know, to be honest. I just I searched for an image that was free to use, and that was one of the ones that came up. We do use them in our Fit Studio, so if you drop me an email, I'll dig out the ones that we use and send that through to you.
Yeah, on that point, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to side light if you're going to do video analysis. When I first started doing video analysis, I used to try and put a lot of light into the room, but really you need to light the plane you're attempting to analyze. So that those LED lights, we have 2 or 3 different types of them. We'll do our best to help you find good ones. So if you send an email to Andy or to me, we'd be happy to help you find those. But you will be quite frustrated attempting to put enough lumens into your Fit Studio with ambient light to make a difference. So that side light is critical to getting blur-free, high-quality video.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today. And if you do have any questions at any point, oh, we got another one. Yeah, no problem. Franklin, thanks for joining us. Okay. Thanks very much. Look forward to hearing from you all soon. And please join us on the next webinars there.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care.